Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy, and today is a big day. Today is session number 29 on the peoples of Middle-earth, but of course, that is also the end of, this is going to be the end, the last session of our, not only of our discussion of the peoples of Middle-earth, but of our entire discussion of the history of Middle-earth here on May 13th, 2026. We have come to the end of a very long, a more than 10-year study of the entire history of Middle-earth. Of course, we've read a whole bunch of other things in the interim, including some very long books and some very long discussions. Yeah, Maureen, it would be fun to know how many total sessions we'd done on the history of Middle-earth. But in any case, it's been a long time. I was a lot younger. I was a lot younger when we started. I suppose we all were. But yeah, it's going to be really fun. So looking ahead at what is coming, I wanted to remind folks that we're going to be off for a couple weeks after tonight, and then we're going to return with another book, because it may be the end of the history of Middle-earth, but it's not the end of books. So we're going to resume on June 3rd, Wednesday, June 3rd, with the discussion of Fantastes by George MacDonald. And remember, the text I'm going to be using is our Signum Classics edition of Fantastes. So if you go to collaboratory.signumuniversity.org and go to our store, you will find Fantastes edited by Julian Barr right here. And you can add this to your card. It's $9.99, and you'll be able to download it. You'll be able to read it in ebook readers and all that sort of thing. Or, of course, you can subscribe to the Collaboratory, in which case it will be here in the Signum Library, and you'll be able to read it here, along with all these other awesome books and projects and things that are going on. So there we are. That's how you can very easily acquire the text of our next book, Fantastes. And we'll start that on June 3rd. Now, I would also, looking ahead beyond that, we have no clear plans for what we're going to be discussing after that. I imagine it's going to take us a few months to read through Fantastes together. Fantastes is not a book that I know well, by the way. I've read it before, but I think I've only read it once or maybe twice, but it was a while ago that I did read it. So I'm coming to it pretty fresh and really looking forward to discovering it together with you guys. But after Fantastes, we don't know. So we're going to be organizing some kind of election, I think, to make that happen. We haven't had an election in a long time. There are lots of reasons for this, not the least of which is my own pokiness. But it will be time for another election. And we'll be able to, if people want to do another Tolkien book, we could do another Tolkien book. We could do, Tales from the Perilous Realm would be interesting, David Michael. We haven't done a reading together of Tolkien's shorter stories, which would be interesting. There's all kinds of things that we could do. There are other Tolkien things that we could do. I'm looking at my shelf over here. We could do, oh man, I've just been rereading his translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and that whole collection. That's really fun. So many things that we could do. Yeah. Anyway, Mr. Bliss. Yeah, totally. Beowulf. We could do Beowulf. You want to read Beowulf in Tolkien's translation? Yeah, sure. Rover Random. I think Rover Random be included in Tales from the Perilous Realm. Yeah. So lots of fun opportunities to. I remember years ago. Coming to the end of the history of Middle-earth reminds me of this conversation that I had with someone. This was, a few years after I'd started my podcast. So I'd been podcasting at that point for like 2-3 years. This was, I don't know, 15 years ago or something. And I remember this person saying to me, but what are you going to do when you run out of Tolkien to discuss? I sometimes reflect back on that conversation when we're having conversations like we were having last night in Exploring the Lord of the Rings about how almost none of us are going to survive to the end of the Lord of the Rings. In that discussion, there's always more to talk about. So even as we come to the end of the history of Middle-earth, there's more there. And of course, every other book, we're still going to talk about other things. I have loved over the years. I started the Mythgard Academy back, I think in 2013 is what I want to say. It might have been 2012, but I think it was 2013. And summer of 2013, if I'm remembering correctly. And yeah, I have really enjoyed the last, whatever it is, 13 years since we began this. It's one of the few opportunities I get to do the kind of detailed discussion of not Tolkien, right? So it's like both things. On the one hand, I get the opportunity to dig deep into Tolkien stuff, that I don't spend every day with. This trip through the history of Middle-earth has just been transformative for me over the last decade. I've learned so much about Tolkien and so much about his writing, by which I mean his patterns of writing, how he writes, how he thinks. Nothing that I've ever read or done in my life has been as illuminating to Tolkien's patterns of thought and habits of writing as reading through the history of Middle-earth carefully with you guys. It's again, I've learned so much. So there's sort of deep dive stuff to dig into, but also the opportunity to do other books. Oh, there we go. Eric did the math. So we've had, this is session number, what is it, 187 today, if today's 29. So it's 187 sessions, plus we did another 26 for the what's it called? The Nature of Middle-earth, right? Which isn't really part of History of Middle-earth, but yeah. Oh, this is number 186. Okay. 186. So in 186 sessions, we have gone all the way through the history of Middle-earth. That's not bad. It's pretty good. I know some of them we were kind of quick on. By the way, sometimes people ask me, you'll look back and be like, wow, Middle-earth, not just the history of Middle-earth, but like Mythgard Academy used to be a lot quicker. Why isn't it as quick anymore? And I can answer that. It's pretty easy to answer that. The answer is I'm much busier now than I was. Believe it or not, I have less time now than I did back then. Which means like to cover a book in fewer sessions requires more prep that I don't have time for anymore. So less prep equals more sessions. That's just kind of how it works. So yeah, exactly. We did Lays of Beleriand, a whole volume of poetry in 9 sessions. Yeah. Because I was prepping. I remember the time I used to spend prepping. I remember where I was when I was doing that. That was a while ago. But yeah, that's where we are. And as I keep saying during our 29 session stroll through the peoples of Middle-earth, that I don't regret it. And I am always delighted to immerse myself further in these things. But let's actually get into it, or else I'm gonna not finish. Well, I'm gonna finish. The question is just like how late I have to stay up in order to finish. But we'll be fine. Okay, ready? Here we go. So we got to Tal-Elmar, the final story in the Peoples of Middle-earth last time, and we were looking at the opening and the establishment of it. So you remember that this seemed to be a story that Tolkien came back to a couple times. There's the manuscript, a typescript. The typescript ends, and then a rough manuscript continues. So this seems to be him going back and continuing a story that he had done before. And it seems to me that this story is sort of evolving. Remember the very opening that we discussed last time, where the geography is really unclear? Like, is this in Middle-earth or is it not Middle-earth? It sounds like it could be in Middle-earth, but the business about like being able to walk to the sea, dry shod. And you'll remember the very first draft where he explicitly placed it in our world and was talking about walking from Rome to York dry shod, was even sort of stranger. So is this a story that is sort of set in our world in some way? Or is this something that's set in Middle-earth in the Second Age? Or is that sort of shifting around? It seems possible. It would not be strange for him to be importing things from Middle-earth into a non-Middle-earth story. Look at what happens to the Notion Club papers, for instance, which does not begin as a Middle-earth story, but then kind of becomes a Middle-earth story. That is a kind of thing that happened a lot. Whether he begins by trying to, by writing a different story while recycling some elements of, the Middle-earth world, the Middle-earth legends, and then the thing grows and kind of takes over, or whether he simply gets the impulse to attach it more, like once he gets into writing it, he sees how it is a part of the world. I'm always reminded, speaking of Tolkien's short stories, if you know Leaf by Niggle, you may remember the reference to the fact that Niggle was painting this huge painting of a tree, and he had previously liked to just paint leaves, just little pictures of leaves. But as time went on, he kept like attaching the leaves to his tree. Like he'd take the little canvases from his little leaf pictures and staple them to the big canvas so it was all one single thing. Anyway, that's David Michael. That's a really interesting example. The original start of the Lay of Lathian. He begins writing the Lay of Lathian, and for people with attentive memories like David Michael has, will recall that the very first draft of the Lay of Lathian was a poem about a blonde girl named Melilot, which sounded much more like some kind of Arthurian tale, perhaps. And then the next thing you know, it becomes a Middle-earth story, and then bam, Melilot becomes Luthien, and now it's a totally different story, right? Green Grey Dragon speculates that Melilot danced and she fell a lot. There are certainly jokes that suggest themselves, aren't there? Anyway, so these, and again, we see this happening in other ways, even with other things. Jackie and David Michael were talking about Farmer Giles of Ham, to which he was trying to write a sequel, which was also becoming sort of Middle-earth proximate as well. But anyway, that's it's a common phenomenon, and this tale seems to be growing in the telling in that way. I myself have a particular theory about what kind of tale he's writing, which seems to me to sort of fit chronologically anyway with tales that he was interested in, during this part of his life, anyhow. And then it becomes more explicitly more explicitly a Middle-earth story. Look at here's the description of our protagonist, Tal-Elmar. Save one only, being a reference to his other 16 sons, the other 16 sons of Hazad being just like him. Save one only, and he was the youngest. Tal-Elmar, Hazad his father named him. He was yet but 18 years of age, and lived with his father, and the 2 of his brothers next elder. He was tall and white-skinned, and there was a light in his grey eyes that would flash to fire if he were wroth, and though that happened seldom, and never without great cause, it was a thing to remember and beware of. Those who had seen that fire called him Flint-Eye, and respected him, whether they loved him or no. For Tal-Elmar might seem, among that swart, sturdy folk, slender-built and lacking in the strength of leg and neck that they praised. But a man that strove with him soon found him strong beyond guess, and sudden and swift, hard to grapple, and harder to elude. So, there's this guy who doesn't look anything like his father, or most of his brothers, or the people around him. And, by the way, you remember that story from Sir Thomas Malory about King Pellinore and Sir Tor, his son, his bastard son? When the shepherd or cowherd or farmer, whatever he was, peasant dude, anyway, brings his sons to Arthur's court, and his youngest son, Sir Tor, is like way taller and more beautiful than everybody else. And it turns out that he is the son of King Pellinore instead. This sounds very much like that moment. It was a cowherd. That's what that was my guess. 'Cause yeah, it's like a little bit of a joke, right? Cowherd, of course, is where the word coward came from, as far as I know. But anyway, so, right, but like Sir Tor is no cowherd, is he? But anyhow, but this is not just a question. This is not just a story about questionable paternity, right? This story does not turn out to be one that, simply explicable by the fact that, Tal-Elmar had dallied with a knight of Arthur's court or an elf or something like that. Instead, what this sounds like, A.D. Purtle says there's nothing cowardly about trying to herd cattle. A.D. Purtle, I've always found it an interesting irony that in American lore and tradition, to be a cowboy is like one of the coolest, toughest, boldest archetypes of the American imagination, which is very different from the archetype that cowherds served in the medieval imagination. It's just kind of interesting. But anyway, so back to Tal-Elmar here. What it reminds me of, do you remember those stories and poems that Tolkien was writing in the time when he was really interested in foundling stories? Like the poem King Horn, right? King Sheev. Yeah, you've got King Sheev and all those. Yes, those are the ones. This, of course, was also at the same time that he was doing a lot of thinking about Numenor as well. So, yeah, anyway, this, of course, was picking up on a well-known medieval tradition. The tradition of shield chafings, for instance. Yes, the unexpected luck of widows' sons, fencing frog, that kind of thing, right? But you may remember the references in the opening lines to Beowulf, which you doubtly have off by heart and can recite in Old English. So I know Eric probably can, and maybe one or two others of you as well. But in any case, in the opening lines of Beowulf, we hear about shield chafing, who was the forerunner of the Danes, Hrothgar and such, who was a foundling boy, who then grows up, so he comes on a boat and they rescue him, and he grows up and becomes king and is remarkable and extraordinary. That's a popular story in the Middle Ages. In this part of the Middle Ages, Tolkien's part of the Middle Ages. And of course, so you can see how both his interest in these stories and these poems and his own invention, the way in which within his own imagination he was reinventing the Atlantis myth, and his impulse for myths of explanation that we saw in his early days. Now this is not the same as those. By the myths of explanation, I mean like way back in the Book of Lost Tales, when we're getting like, why does the moon have, dark spots on it? Or why do cats and dogs not get along with each other in general? And those questions are answered by the mythic stories that he tells about who went into Vildo, or about the dropping of the moonflower before it gets put in the chariot and all that sort of thing. I don't mean that kind of like, sort of grandiose, like cosmological explanations, mythical explanations. But Tolkien, so the stories, the medieval stories, like the stories of shield chafing, just leave it a mystery. They never give an answer. So where did shield chafing come from? Exactly. Like what these like foundling boys who show up and are just like head and shoulders more extraordinary than everybody else in the land where they're adopted, and become king and famous and all these things. That's they never had an explanation for that. It was just a mystery. And Tolkien has a story. He seems to have been interested in that story, and Numenor seems to be his answer to the question. Tal-Elmar, it seems to me, is very directly connected with that. As indeed, Tal-Elmar, who is, as we were just reading, different, the way of differences, his tallness, the light in his gray eyes that flash to fire, sounds either Elvish or Numenorean. And we'll get a little bit more about his background. But it seems very much that he's sort of writing another one of those stories. Which means, so remember his like indecision in the opening paragraph as to whether he was telling a story about Europe or whether he was telling a story about Middle-earth in the Second Age. Or in some age. He doesn't really specify, certainly even in the final version, as it is, of the first paragraph of this work. Or possibly both at once, Fencing Frog, I agree. But I think when he's thinking of Europe, I think that's how he's thinking. And by the way, so my own theory about Tal-Elmar is that it begins in his imagination. It begins as another one of those stories. It's a little bit different. Like Tal-Elmar doesn't get pulled out of a boat as an infant or anything. This is not a story of a boat wafts to shore with, full of like treasure and armor and a baby. And then the baby grows up physically different from everybody else with extraordinary, and all that. So it's not that. It's not that. And Jackie, yes, if you are remembering Shasta being wafted onto shore by the breath of Aslan and being raised by people whom he is very different than, you know that C.S. Lewis has read those same stories too. And quite likely some of Tolkien's versions of those stories, actually. But in any case, Tolkien's not doing exactly that story. He's not just doing the King Sheev thing. He's not just doing the Kinghorn thing. He is doing, he's doing something similar. And in this case, it's more of a, like, the blood will out sort of thing. Yeah, you could call it a tale of expression of recessive genes, Tomas, though that would not be Tolkien's vocabulary for it, right? But it's sort of it is in that sense a sort of a riff on this particular tradition, not a foundling story, but a story of the blending, and in some cases, I guess, as we see here, the like imperfect blending of the the foreign blood with these people of the darkness, as they will be called later. So again, he's kind of riffing on the King Sheev, Kinghorn, shield chafing sort of motif. But as it goes on, I think it gets drawn more and more. I think that's why he was originally thinking of Rome and York. I think that's why he was thinking of Europe originally, and a sort of mythic, prehistorical Europe, because he's thinking about Numenor. Not in the sense of I'm writing a Second Age Middle-earth story, but in the sense of I'm writing a medieval story and imagining the boats from Numenor coming. That was the word, not just in the narrator figure of Ælfwine, but repeatedly. Numenor is the story of all of Tolkien's Middle-earth story. Numenor is the story that is closest to our world, that has most encounters with our world and our history. It's the only one that, in a sense, in Tolkien's imagination, at least in his imagination when writing these other stories, shows up in our world. He didn't write stories of people, of like, Anglo-Saxon dudes meeting elves in the woods. He didn't write those stories. But he does write stories about Anglo-Saxon dudes discovering a Numenorean baby in a boat. So Numenor, maybe it's because it's a human story. Maybe it's because it's a human story. But I don't know. But whether it's in like the shield chafing sort of sense, whether it's these like active memories of Numenor that Tolkien is perceiving within these actual medieval poetical traditions, or whether it's the invasion of the Numenorean story through the past into the present in the Notion Club papers. A lot of Tolkien's stories, which are explicitly stories in our world. So, like, I don't mean... So, Farmer Giles of Ham, at least... well, actually, forget Farmer Giles of Ham's a bad data point in a couple ways. Smith of Wootton Major, Leaf by Niggle, those are not stories that are like... that they take place somewhere else, but they're neither Middle-earth nor our world. Notion Club papers, but like when he, as he does in the Notion Club papers, starts to write about our world, Numenor keeps creeping in. I mean, that's just, to me, that's a really interesting fact, and it seems to put Numenor and the Numenor stories just simply in a different category. And it's a very interesting one because his legendarium begins with a desire to explain the memory of elvish things in the world. I mean, if you go back and read Cortirion Among the Trees, that, poem from 1914, I think, you go back and read the first version of that, the I think it was 1914, maybe 1916 version of that poem. So way back at the beginning, before he'd really begun in earnest writing the Legendarium, it's a poem about somebody who's walking about in Warwickshire and is encountering memories and echoes of elvishness. And so Tolkien's Legendarium as a whole seems to originate with that. Seems to originate with a desire to tell the stories behind that. Why do particular places in England remember the elves? Why is there that sense of elvishness still around in some places? Who were they? The elves. Where did they go? Why were they here? Where did they go? What happened? And explaining those things. Explaining those things is where the Book of Lost Tales and the Legendarium begins. But as he moves through the Legendarium, it's not the elf stories that creep through into our world anymore. It's Numenor. It's Numenor that keeps doing it. And almost every story about our world, whether contemporary, like the Notion Club papers, or historical, Numenor just seems to keep popping up, seems to keep invading it. And that's a really interesting thing to think about, sort of the trajectory of Tolkien's creative life. I'm going to try not to spend all night tonight thinking back and remembering all the things we've learned for the entirety of the History of Middle-earth series discussions, or else we're certainly not going to finish. But yeah, David Michael, I do agree that as his writings went on from the early days through the Numenor story and then through the Lord of the Rings as well, that he thought more about mortality and the desire for deathlessness by the younger race than, he was thinking about the perspective of the older race. And I think it's also true that, as both David Michael and somebody else was just talking about this as well, his dream of the wave, right? The way in which the Numenor story became an expression of something very personal. That recurring dream that he had about the wave. And having a son also, Jackie, as you say, who shared his Atlantis dreams, Michael. So yeah, maybe that's part of it. My goal is not to try to psychoanalyze Tolkien and come up with that sort of a psychological explanation for why he did this exactly, just to observe that it happened. And obviously it's not like he falls out of love with elves or ceases to take an interest in the elder days or anything like that. But the role of Numenor in his stories is peculiar. 80 Pearl, you had said that. Yes. And then yeah, it's peculiar. And seeing it manifested here, I think Tal-Elmar becomes a really interesting example of this kind of Numenorean invasion. And this is where I come back to the dates. Somewhere between 1950 and 1955-ish is where Tal-Elmar was beginning. If it's towards the end of that period, as Christopher seemed to suspect, then we're very much... Remember Christopher's comment about not understanding why his dad is working on Tal-Elmar at a time when he was under intense pressure to publish all of the appendices, which he was, as we know, making slow progress on. But I wonder if that's a big part of the reason why he was writing Tal-Elmar. And I think that what we see in Tal-Elmar is the impulse to write one of those medieval Europe stories with a Numenorean invasion, which not only then experiences a Numenorean invasion within the story, so that we're imagining, people from what some folks call the Dark Ages, but which Tolkien wouldn't approve of, though it's interesting, actually, in the context of this story, isn't it? With Numenoreans, right? We get, as I said, a different version of that. Not the foundling story, but a mingling story. And yet, as he begins telling that tale, it totally grows into a First Age story. Like by the end, it's explicitly and clearly, a First Age story, a Second Age story. Like it's clearly a Middle Earth story by the end, and ceases at all to be a Middle Ages story. And it's even clearer that as he goes back later on, like in 1968, and, starts making notes like that little blurb that he wrote in 1968, it's clear that he was like, yeah, this needs to be hauled more thoroughly and more consistently into the Second Age from the jump, right? So yeah, Maureen, I think that's exactly what's happening. I think the appendices are inspiring him. Remember all of those Second Age stories that were trying to grow and that he was stomping on. And I think once he starts writing this the Numenoreans come to the Middle Ages story, there's my unofficial name for this particular genre of Tolkien's, subgenre of Tolkien's work. He can't resist the impulse to write more Numenor stories, like an actual Second Age Numenor story, because the Second Age Numenor stories are just bursting out of him, and the darn publisher won't let him write them all, right? And yes, I agree, Jackie. Him working things out, like working story out and working details out through story within story within story, yeah, it's very typical. The way that he seizes this story as an opportunity to think more about the Numenorean incursions into not the Middle Ages, but into Middle Earth, right? What was that like? What were the relationships? It's one thing to say in the Akalabeth that now the Numenoreans came to Middle Earth as conquerors and took tribute and hauled them off in chains as slaves. I mean, he says he describes that relationship in like one sentence, two sentences, right? He wants to see it. He wants to explore it. A.D. Pirtle, exactly that. And I think that's what we're going to see him doing here. But I have an idea. Let's actually go and see some more things. For Tal-Elmar had a strange belief. So we were just looking at the physical differences. Now let's look at the internal differences of Tal-Elmar to his other siblings, for instance. For Tal-Elmar had a strange belief, whence it came was a wonder, that the old should be treated kindly and with courtesy, and should be suffered to live out their life days in such ease as they could. What a weirdo, right? If ye must gainsay them, he said, let it be done with respect, for they have seen many years, and many times, maybe, have they faced the evils which we come to untried. And grudge not their food and their room, for they have laboured longer than have ye, and do but receive now belatedly part of the payment that is due to them. Such plain folly had no effect on the manners of his people, but it was law in his house, and it was now 2 years since either of his brothers had dared to break it. So, Tal-Elmar is not just physically different. This is not only a difference in nature, but despite the similarities in nurture, his character is different as well. He just has different values. And I love the way he the narrator's voice here. Such plain folly had no effect on the manners of his people. The dismissiveness of the narrator towards Tal-Elmar's peculiar attitude about, treating the old kindly, shows how, not just how different he was, not just how deviant he is from his society, but it's like, where did that come from? Where did he pick up this idea? If he not only didn't learn it from the people around him, but it's actively resisted and dismissed by everybody around him, why does he believe it at all? And I think that this seems to be an element. Remember, one of the things that this is an experiment in. Remember the differences between this and like the King Sheev story. He's not a foundling. Tal-Elmar's not a foundling. He's a son of Hazad. And what's different seems to be his blood. Remember the reference to how, like, when Gandalf says that that Faramir, like in Faramir, the blood of Numenor runs true. Yeah, Jackie, you were just thinking of exactly that. Yeah, and Denethor also, as it does in his father, but did not in his brother. There's something there, like Faramir's. It's not just Faramir's, physical characteristics. Boromir looks reasonably Numenorean so far as that goes, but it's these inner things. If you look at Boromir and Faramir standing side by side, you don't see like Sir Tor and his brothers. You don't see Tal-Elmar and his squat, swarthy brothers. So again, it's with Faramir and Boromir, it's not at all physical. It's all internal. And it seems to be something more. It seems to be something more of a spiritual heritage, I would say. A.D. Pirtle, I agree. It's not genetics, and I would urge you not to think in genetic terms. There's an important reason for that. I said before that that's not Tolkien's vocabulary, and it's not, clearly. But what's more, if you think in genetic terms, like if you're translating Tolkien into genetic terms, you're imposing a very different kind of paradigm. The idea of genetics, the mythology of genetics is one particular kind of story, one particular kind of mythology. Keep in mind, I'm not using the word myth or mythology to imply that genetics is inaccurate as a theory about how inheritance from parent to child works. But I am saying that the idea of genetics has a mythic power in our own imaginations and the imaginations of modern people. It has provided a mythic framework for us to think about inheritance. They used to have very different ones. And Tolkien's is closer to the older ones, like the ones at the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century. You can still see the old ideas of blood tells. You might easily find characters in, say, an Agatha Christie book or in an Ella Montgomery story, the Anne of Green Gables author. Say something like blood tells. You can actually see it several times in the beginning of Anne of Green Gables itself, actually talking about Anne, who's an orphan, and people are wondering like what blood she's from and stuff. And absolutely, Fencing Frog, you can see it in Dracula with the transfusions. Remember the reference to how pure Arthur Holmwood's blood is, and therefore how effective it would be for the transfusion? Totally. Anyway, my point is, that was one sort of, provided this one mythic understanding that was accepted by very many people. I think that we're always tempted. Modern people are always doing this, are always thinking like, when our ideas change, that means we've gotten better, right? That means we've improved, like we've moved forward. We're like more advanced than those people. Like those people had those horrible beliefs, but we now know that those are nonsense and our beliefs are accurate. We've adopted a different mythology. Yes, it is true. And that mythology has different implications on the way that we look at people. And many of those ways in which many of the ways in which that's different are nicer. But many of them are not either. And we're blind to those. We're as blind to those as the people, 100 years ago were blind to the sort of the negative impact, which we can see now really very clearly, in justification of racism and things like that. That speaks our language. So we see their shortcomings really clearly. We don't see our own shortcomings quite as clearly, right? It is Green Great Dragon, as you say. It's all chronological snobbery. Yeah, as Fencing Frog points out, you can get to eugenics by traveling down either road. Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, point is, and by the way, I think it not true. Was Tolkien raised within that culture? Like the same culture that you can hear the same mythology of blood and race that you can hear coming out in authors like L. Montgomery or Bram Stoker or Agatha Christie or Haggard or any of those things. Any of those authors from that time period. Is Tolkien just is what he's expressing here just the same as them? I say no, it's not the same. Is it connected? Is it related to it? Yeah. It definitely shares characteristics with it. But again, the way that they talked about blood telling, in the early 20th century, would not at all explain Boromir and Faramir. Not in the way that Tolkien talks about that. Not in the way that we see it with Tal-Elmar. Tal-Elmar is not Sir Tor. He's not a bastard child with a totally different parentage that nobody knew about. That's going to be revealed. That's the similarity, but also the contrast is one of the reasons I brought up that story. Tal-Elmar and his brothers, who look nothing like him, are full brothers. Like Boromir and Faramir are full brothers. Unlike Boromir and Faramir, Tal-Elmar and his brothers don't look at all alike. But like Boromir and Faramir, Tal-Elmar and his brothers have a very different makeup. I think, yes, it's blood running true. Again, that's the language of it. He is similar to the language that's used, again, by others in this time period. But what he's talking about is different. And again, I think in this passage, again, where does Tal-Elmar get this about being kind to your elders when it is aggressively countercultural? I think that one of the, I'm not sure precisely what to do with this. I mean, this is not a prominent thing that Tolkien talks about a lot or we see a lot. But I think here that what we're seeing is something along the lines of some kind of spiritual heritage. It's not about genetics. And I don't think it's even just about blood. He doesn't talk about Tal-Elmar's blood. Exactly. It seems to be some kind of spiritual influence or something. Anyway, it's complicated. But I think I can easily see, no, let me say this a different way. If you wanted to like make an argument that Tolkien, was invested in these old paradigms of inheritance, which most modern people dismiss as racist, and you could make that argument, like it would be easily possible to defend that proposition, and this story would give you some really interesting details to use to defend that proposition. But there are many propositions that can be defended that I think are wrong. Or rather that I think like they can be defended because there's stuff there. Like it's connected. But I think it's wrong because I don't think it tells the whole story or anything like the whole story. Anyway, just wanted to kind of bring that into because it's involved here. There's a whole bunch of controversial stuff involved in this. That is, and by controversial stuff, I mean, this story brings up a lot of things that modern readers have hair triggers to detect just because of how we're acculturated, right? We are taught to look for racism, and so we find it. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just saying we're quick to find it because we're trained to find that. There's another thing that we have been for several decades trained to find, and which is easy to see and interesting to see in this story. We'll get to it in a minute. Oh, Green Great Dragon. Hang on. Really great question. Is it similar to... So Green Great Dragon is thinking of the Old Testament Bible story of the anointing of David as king. So Samuel, the prophet, is told by God to go to the house of Jesse, where the future king of Israel is currently residing, because it's one of Jesse's sons. Jesse has a whole bunch of sons. Was it 7 sons, I think? Am I right about the 7 sons of Jesse? I might forget the number. It's 8 sons? Well, that's weird. I never thought about that. Why doesn't Jesse have 7 sons? He should have 7 sons. But he doesn't. How fascinating. Anyway, okay. Jesse has 8 sons, apparently. I'm misremembering. Or is it? Yeah. Exactly. He should have 7 or 12. Either one of those would make sense. But anyhow, whatever. I shall contemplate that another day. Anyway, he's got a whole passel of sons, and the sons get lined up in front of the prophet, and Jesse's like, which one is king? And Samuel goes and he looks at each of them and says, not this one, not this one, not this one. You're not it, not it, not it, not it. Right. It's like a sort of a very weighty, okay. Yeah, it's right. It's 8, 7 non-David sons plus David. Okay. Right. All right. Anyway, but David isn't there because David is the kid brother who's out in the field, minding the sheep. And so he's like, do you have any other sons? Cause I'm not seeing it. And then they bring in David and he's like, oh yeah, that's the one. And he anoints him. And so Green Great Dragon's question was, is this sort of distinction? Tal-Elmar is the youngest. And so he is in the, David / Joseph, kind of position, Joseph and Benjamin sort of deal. Anyway, yeah. I mean, there's some similarities there. The main difference, of course, the chief difference between those two stories is the direct intervention of the Almighty. That is, the question with the anointing of David was which one had God chosen? But yet there was also, when David is chosen, God tells Samuel that this is a man after this is the man after his own heart, right? That is, there's something about David. David is different. It's not simply, God doesn't just make him different. God recognizes that he is different. And that Green Great Dragon is, I think, where Tal-Elmar is similar to that. And that does seem to be, it's in the David story. It's not at all, it's certainly not about genetics, but it's not about blood either. Like, there's nothing different about David compared to the other brothers. Except there's something different about David. There's a spiritual difference about him. And that seems to be something like that with Tal-Elmar here. Okay. Hazard loved this youngest son dearly, in return for his love. That is, for how his youngest son loves him. Yet even more for another cause which he kept in his heart, that his face and his voice reminded him of another that he long had missed. For Hazard also had been the youngest son of his mother, and she died in his boyhood, and she was not of their people. Such was the tale that he had overheard, not openly spoken indeed, for it was held no credit to the house. She came of the strange folk, hateful and proud, of which there was rumour in the Westlands, coming out of the East, it was said. Did that throw you as much as it threw me? Like, I thought I saw where we were going. I thought that as soon as we started this paragraph about the mom or the grandmom of Tal-Elmar, I was like, she came out of the West, did she? All right, tracking with you, right? Thought we were doing the Numenorean thing, and then no, she came out of the East. All right, fair, tall, and flint-eyed they were, these Easternesse people, with bright weapons made by demons in the fiery hills. Whoa. Bright weapons made by demons in the fiery hills? Probably elves? Maybe dwarves, but probably elves. Slowly they were thrusting towards the shores of the sea, driving before them the ancient dwellers in the lands. So these humans, which might be elf friends, are moving westward towards the sea. Okay. Not without resistance. There were wars on the east marches, and since the older folk were yet numerous, the incomers would at times suffer great loss and be flung back. Indeed, little had been heard of them in the hills of Agar, which is, of course, where Tal-Elmar lives, far to the west, for more than a man's life, since that great battle of which songs were yet sung, in the valley of Ishmalag it had been fought, the wise in lore told, and there a great host of the fell folk, that is, the men of Easternesse, had been ambushed in a narrow place and slaughtered in heaps. And in that day many captives were taken, for this had been no affray on the borders, or fight with advance guards. A whole people of the fell folk had been on the move, with their wains and their cattle and their women. Yeah, Feanaro, this sounds exactly like people of the House of Hador, or like the House of Beor. It's not, because it is an age or two late, isn't it? Oh, yeah, Green Great Dragon. I was talking about the demons in the fiery hills. What, like volcanoes? Probably. Fiery hills? Where are they? Anyway, geography, not real clear. Chronology, not really clear. This passage is one of the things that makes me think he's still recycling. He's still writing. He's still thinking of a Europe story, a medieval story, and he's recycling things from his legendarium, like the westward migration of the peoples. Notice, like, the whole people is on the move. He never really told any stories about that. What happened when you've got the future House of Hador, which is huge, marching across the continent? Like, how did that work out? Was it not without resistance, perhaps? So we see him indulging, at least momentarily, an imagination of that. What might have that looked like? Especially interesting, what might that have looked like from the point of view of the wild folk? So he's going to do both things? Let's imagine the westward migration of the early peoples of men, and also let's imagine the incursion of the Numenoreans back onto the continent. And yes, since it's so unclear where we are, Fanaro, as you say, it's fun to think about that huge swath of Middle-earth to the east that we never hear about. Yeah. And it seems like perhaps Tolkien is indulging that here. If it is Middle-earth, maybe that's where it is. It doesn't seem to be obvious for both geographical and chronological reasons. It doesn't seem necessarily to be obviously Middle-earth here. And remember, Christopher was acknowledging, like, it's not clear. It's not clear. But okay. Interesting. So, Tal-Elmar takes after his grandma. And Hazad, youngest son of his mother, remembers her with great love because she died in his childhood. Tolkien being able to relate to moms dying in childhood, in one's childhood. And Tal-Elmar takes after her. Right? So again, some of you are still like trying to sort of work out or think like, who could this be or where could this be? I don't think Tolkien knows. I think this is why, remember those notes, like the little blurb that he writes and stuff? He says like what needs to happen is this needs to be more thoroughly integrated. And so I think it's clear. It was not integrated. He was not sitting down picturing a particular place in Middle-earth history or a particular place in Middle-earth geography and telling a story there. He's not just doing that thing that we would be kind of interested to see him do, which is like, I'm going to tell a story out of Rune that we never hear stories out of. Or I'm going to tell a story out of the middle of the Second Age, which we never hear stories out of, or very few. He's going to get there. He's going to decide to turn it into one of those things. But it doesn't seem to me to be where it starts. Yeah. Let's keep going though. Here it comes. That other thing that we have been taught for a couple decades to be very sensitive to in stories that we read. So be it, said Boldar. But it is not, this is the grandfather of Tal-Elmar, the father of Hazad, who takes the captured woman of the east of Easternesse as his wife, as a spoil of war, right? And she says, I will never stop loving the husband and child that I've been taken away from, and I'm never going to love you. And this is the husband / father / grandfather's response. So be it, said Boldar. But it is not to be thought that I should let thee go free. for thou art precious in my sight. And consider well, vain is it to seek to escape from me. Long is the way to the remnant of thy folk, if any still live, and thou wouldst not go far from the hills of Agar ere thou met with death, or a life far worse than shall be thine in my house. Base and unlovely thou namest us. Truly, maybe. Yet true is it also that thy folk are cruel and lawless and the friends of demons. Thieves are they, for our lands are ours from of old, which they would wrest from us with their bitter blades. White skins and bright eyes are no warrant for such deeds. Hoo-hoo! Yowza! White skins and bright eyes are no warrant for such deeds? Are they not? Said she. Then neither are thick legs and wide shoulders. Or by what means did ye gain these lands that ye boast of? Are there not, as I hear men say, wild folk in the caves of the mountains, who once roamed here free, ere ye swart folk came hither and hunted them like wolves? Okay. So, yes, Erucheb is thinking of the Forgoil. So was I. I could not help but think of the Rohirrim and Dunlendings when I was reading this passage, because this is exactly the conversation we never hear anyone have. Tolkien acknowledges several times, like in many places we see, that the Rohirrim drove the Dunlendings out. In some way, we don't know the whole story, right? What we do know is that the Dunlendings still harbor resentment. That the people with white skins and bright eyes came in and took their lands. We don't know exactly how justified are their complaints. That's the point. We never hear the story. We never hear the story, and we never hear them talking about it. And Adi Purtle, I too wish the War of the Rohirrim had delved into that. I would have loved to have more dealing with the Dunlending Rohirrim question and less importation of elephants into the mark, but whatever. Anyhow, but that's just me complaining. The closest thing to this that we get in The Lord of the Rings is Fencing Frog, as you're talking about. You were remembering Hanburi talking about the wild men getting hunted like beasts, presumably by the Rohirrim, as he is saying to Theoden, don't hunt us like beasts anymore. Now, it's possible that Hanburi is generalizing, that he's sort of taking the Rohirrim, who are the ones with whom he's speaking at the moment, as like representatives of all the other peoples. So maybe it wasn't actually the Rohirrim themselves who hunted them, but maybe it was. And Feanara's Pizza, of course, there's the petty dwarves as well. Yes, Meme has some complaints about how the petty dwarves were treated. And in the Silmarillion, it mentions, Adi Purtle, as you say, that there was a time when the elves hunted the dwarves. Anyway, point is that this is an issue. The displacement of peoples that comes up a bunch of times in Tolkien's works, but which he does not spend much time talking about. And here in this passage, we get a more direct addressing of that subject than anywhere that I can think of in Tolkien's entire corpus. White skins and bright eyes are no warrant for such deeds. He accuses them of trying to come in and kick them out of their lands, which they probably are, the Easterlings, the men of Easternesse. Elf friends, though they probably are friends of demons. Cruel, lawless, friends of demons? Maybe. And look at how she turns it around on him. Okay. Who are you? Didn't you displace somebody else? A question too rarely asked. It's so simple sometimes. Like, again, people never ask that about the Dunlendings. It's easy to make arguments about Middle-earth, about Tolkien's world, in which you just call the Dunlendings indigenous peoples. You just make an obvious analog between the Rohirrim as European invaders and the Dunlendings as indigenous peoples. And are there similarities? There absolutely are important similarities there, which, again, as we can see here, Tolkien is far from dodging in this place. But at the same time, it is not true that we know for sure the history of the Dunlendings. Was there somebody else that they took the land from? The Woses might say yes, in fact. Remember that we see evidence in the Pukelmen of Dunharrow that there was an older people yet who lived in that land, very likely before the Dunlendings did. So anyway, it is a fascinating question, but once again, it's really easy. As I say, we have a hair trigger for this topic. But one thing I've noticed, when particular issues, when particular questions that tend to get asked of texts, in my business, that is in the business of literary interpretation, in the English professor business, we call these lenses through which one reads a text. I'm going to read the text through a feminist lens, or through a post-colonial lens, or whatever. What that means is there are certain questions that you are always asking the text, certain things you're always looking for or interested in when they come up, which is fine. That is true of everybody. And when you are looking for things, you can notice some really interesting stuff that you might not notice at all if you weren't asking those particular questions. But the danger always is that it's easy to make really simple answers, especially if you have a narrative in your head already about what post-colonial readings of a text are or what they show you, right? Fencing Frog, that's another really interesting example. But it's not your own shire, says Gildor to Frodo. I love that example. Anyway, so we get lots of material for a post-colonial reading of Tolkien in this passage. But if we emerge from it, if all we do is take that one sentence, white skins and bright eyes are no warrant for such deeds, I could easily imagine there are people who want to read Tolkien and to make out that Tolkien is a racist, who want to make out that Tolkien is an imperialist, pro-displacement of indigenous people, or at least uncaring about it. Because the Rohirrim are white people who moved in and displaced an indigenous people, and they're the heroes, so ergo imperialist. That version of the reading that I just gave is obviously a really simplistic reading, but I've heard many very simplistic readings about this kind of thing. That's my point. The situation is much more nuanced than that, and it's more nuanced than I could see somebody, a Tolkien fan, reading this passage and taking that last line, that incredible line, white skins and bright eyes are no warrant for such deeds, and using that as some sort of proof text to prove that Tolkien was not imperialist. See? Now we have Tolkien, the champion of the displaced peoples. That's an oversimplification too, though. The story is much more complicated than that. That's what he's giving us, is a complicated story. I agree, A.D. Pirtle, that scoring points is easier than thinking. And it's certainly easier than considering nuances and all of the relevant information and trying to understand the fuller, more nuanced picture. Yeah, Jackie, you are so right. It is very much a trend in Tolkien's later writings. This trend of him constantly arguing both sides of almost every issue. We see it here. We see it in Aldarion and Arendis. We saw it in the New Shadow, right? That impulse. We see a great deal. And I agree with you. That happens more and more in Tolkien's later writing. The Athrobeth, right? I mean, that's earlier than many of those other things. But I think in the Athrobeth, we're seeing, like, not the very beginnings, but the early stages of him kind of thinking in those directions. Yeah. Anyway. If I'm correct that the demons in question are elves, that makes this a very remarkable story in the Tolkien corpus, doesn't it? There have been very few stories that Tolkien wrote from a point of view that hates and fears the elves like this. And that's interesting. Okay, let's keep going. So this is Elmar, the wife of Easternesse, the grandma. She's going to have vengeance for her enslavement, her being taken to wife against her will, and having many children with her new husband by force. And this vengeance I will have, that while my body is kept here in exile, the lot of all this folk shall worsen, and thine most. But when my body goes to the alien earth, and my thought is free of it, then in thy kin one shall arise who is mine alone, and with his arising shall come the end of thy people and the downfall of your king. Definitely not about genetics. Tal-Elmar's weirdness, right? In fact, Green Great Dragon, this is not quite the anointing of young David, but there is an element of destiny, of prophecy, of choice. That is, of external choice here. But it's not God choosing his anointed, it's grandma's vindictive prophecy, right? Yeah, there's a chosen one element, Maureen, here, which seems to have impacted his, that is Tal-Elmar's, makeup. Erocheb, I agree with you. Erocheb is speaking of the fact that the line between elves and dwarves is thin in confused human mythologies, so we shouldn't assume Hazad's people would distinguish them necessarily. Yeah, Tolkien did know about that. Dwarves and elves and dark elves, and in Norse mythology, the lines are not real clear. And Tolkien has kind of taken very jumbled together concepts from Norse mythology and developed them in his Middle-earth mythology into something much clearer and more consistent. But Erocheb, you're exactly right, that when he then comes out of that perspective that knows these things clearly, right, out of the elvish framework of the Silmarillion stories and into the worldview of humans who don't understand at all. Yeah, definitely could be. Yeah, so I think, Maureen, I think this is a curse. I don't think it's an oath. I think it's a curse. Though it sounds a little oathy too, doesn't it? I don't know what she thinks her mind is going to be doing when her body goes to the alien Earth. No, she doesn't say her thought is going to bring it about or like invest itself in her descendant or something like that. Seems to be a curse and a foretelling. Yeah, I agree. It sounds like a foretelling. Yeah, Fanara says this makes her even more like Meme. Yeah, kind of does. Heavy stuff. Oh, wait. Now let's do some more world building in this strange, kind of familiar, but kind of not familiar world. 3 folk we hold as enemies. The wild men of the mountains and the woods. Though I say it as shouldn't, you might say. But these only those who stray alone need fear. These are presumably the wild men in the caves who used to live here but have been driven out by these people. So those are the wild men of the mountains and the woods, from the perspective of Hazad's people. The fell folk of the east, that is, Grandma's people, but they are yet far away, and they are my mother's people. This is Hazad speaking, of course. And they are my mother's people, though I doubt not they would not honor the kinship if they came here with their swords. And the high men of the sea. These indeed we may dread as death, for death they worship and slay men cruelly in the honor of the dark. This is right here. That's the sentence. That's the sentence in which we've got a perfectly weird but disconnected story, and then all of a sudden Numenor peeks up over the horizon and is like, hey, I'm here. Right? Now, all of a sudden, it's a Numenor story. For death they worship and slay men cruelly in honor of the dark. Out of the sea they came, and if they ever had any land of their own, ere they came to the west shores, we know not where it may be. Black tales come to us out of the coastlands, north and south, where they have now long time established their dark fortresses and their tombs. Big fancy tombs. But hither they have not come since my father's days, and then only to raid and catch men and depart. So, yeah, all right. Numenor. So now all of a sudden, now we have chronology. I don't know how it fits with the fell folk of the East exactly, who seem to be elf friends, far as I can tell. But yeah. We've got Kingsmen action. This is clearly Numenor in the time of Sauron. We got black Numenoreans. Fencing frog, absolutely. Yep. Okay. But notice, we still have fell folk of the East. Friends of demons. And then there's the wild men. Dread as death. Yeah, see, now we're starting to be able to guess as to where we're located, right? Blacktails have come to us out of the coastlands, north and south. South, probably Umbar. No, okay, in 2 sentences, it's like, boom, zoom in. Now we know. Now we know our geography. Now we know our chronology. Doesn't always fit with everything else, but now we know. Yeah, probably Londyre and Umbar. Yeah. So you've got up on the coast of Eriador, where we've been cutting down lots and lots of trees, and we've got down in Umbar, probably. So where are we? Gondorish, Pelargir-ish. But wait, wasn't Pelargir also a settlement of the Numenoreans? Yes, of the faithful. Oh, that might come relevant. This is a prediction of what will happen. They might bring stuff. These they will sell to us for a small price, or give as gifts, feigning friendship and pity for our need. And they will dwell a while, and spy out the land and the numbers of the folk, and then go. And if they do not return, men should be thankful. For if they come again, it is in other guise. In greater numbers they come then, 2 ships or more together, stuffed with men and not goods. And ever one of the accursed ships hath black wings, that is, sails. For that is the ship of the dark, and in it they bear away evil booty, captives packed like beasts, the fairest women and children, or young men unblemished, and that is their end. Some say that they are eaten for meat, others that they are slain with torment on the black stones in the worship of the dark. Just throwing it out there, not quite sure. Both maybe are true. The foul wings of the seamen have not been seen in these waters for many a year, but remembering the shadow of fear in the past, I cried out and cry again. Is not our life hard enough without a vision of a black wing upon the shining sea? Yes, see, Maureen, when you and Fencing Frog say it sounds like a Native American story or an African story. Yes, it does. It does. And again, we've been trained for decades to see that, to hear that. And it's very interesting to see it and hear it here. It's clearly there. Told not just from told from the point of view of the victims of the Numenorean. Like we're getting this very visceral, very horrible view of the Numenoreans under Sauron in the last stages of Numenor. And from within their own, like, particular, like, mythological place. Now, after this, so this is right after Tal-Elmar and his dad, that was his dad speaking, of course. His dad is telling him stories about, like, Tal-Elmar has just seen 3 ships with white sails and 1 ship with black sails. And he tells his dad, and his dad is like, that paragraph is his dad saying, well, crap, that would be really bad. I hope that's not what you saw. If so, they're here to haul us off as, well, probably to haul Tal-Elmar off to be a sacrifice. So they go to the master of the town, and he's a very unpleasant guy. Tal-Elmar has to physically threaten him to get him to come up to the hilltop and see, and from the hilltop he does see the ships of the sails of the Numenorean ships. And he sends Tal-Elmar off to scout them. Go, go, he shouted. I have commanded thee. This is the master. Thou art quicker to cry wolf than to start on the hunt. Go at once. Go, my son, said Hazad. Do not defy the master. Not where he has the right. For then thou defiest all the town, beyond thy power. And were I the master, I would choose thee, dear though thou be. For thou hast more heart and luck than any of this folk. More luck, huh? Luck-wearer, is he? But come again, and let not the dark ship have thee. Be not over bold. For better would be ill tidings brought by thee living than the seamen without herald. Tal-Elmar bowed and made the sign of submission to his father and not to the master, and strode away 2 paces. and then he turned. "Listen, Mulgrew, whom a base folk in their folly have named their master," he cried. "Maybe I shall return against thy hope. My father I leave in thy care. If I come, be it with word of peace or with a foe at my heel, then thy mastership will be at an end, and thy life also, if I find that he has suffered any evil or dishonor that thou couldst prevent. Thy knifemen and club-bearers will not help thee. I will wring thy fat neck with my bare hands, if needs be, or I will hunt thee through the wilds to the black pools." Okay. Does that remind you of anybody? Tal-Elmar sounding like anybody we know? Kind of reminds me of Turin a little bit here. He doesn't have a father to avenge in this way, except, oh wait, he kind of does. But yeah. Especially the business about hunting him through the wilds. I'm thinking of, Turin and Syros there. Him talking to Mulgrew is kind of like Turin talking to Brandir and disregarding him later on. Just similarities. Not an identity by any means, but I was reminded. Notice, by the way, what a low opinion. Who are the worst leaders in Tolkien's world? Don't they almost always seem to be democratically appointed? Like Mulgrew here and the Master of Lake Town. Tolkien seems to have a low opinion. Even look, people speak affectionately of old Will Whitfoot the Mayor, but he's obviously useless, right? I mean, I think that Sam is the only good elected official in all of Tolkien's. Can you think of any others? Good elected officials in Tolkien's world? Well, Fencing Frog, that's interesting. Is Frodo elected? I'm forgetting. Is there a reference to an actual election? Or does he just kind of step in by kind of general acclaim? Sam's totally elected. Later on. Yeah, Fëanor, they're not all equally bad. The later Master of Lake Town was more wise than the other one, though that is no great mastery. Yeah, right. Frodo's deputized by Will Whitfoot. Sure, right, because he's not fat enough yet to preside at banquets. Yeah, so not sure. He's a step up from the old one, but the old one was quite bad. Anyway, I don't want to draw a too sloppy a generalization here, but this was just a particularly striking example of this. Bjorn might have been elected. Yeah. Sorry, Fencing Frog, I'm laughing. I'm trying to imagine that election, right? Could you imagine being the dude who ran against Bjorn? It's I vote for the giant bear. Don't you? I mean, yeah. Yes, I nominate Bjorn. All opposed? Yes, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, okay. But in any case, it is interesting. Definitely a little trend. Definitely a little trend. Anyway, okay. Be not over bold. Is that overmode? Never mind. Totally different conversation. But I could not help but reading that sentence, be not over bold. I'm like, I am sure I know what Tolkien was thinking about when he wrote that sentence. I feel really confident I know what Tolkien was thinking about. Again, not that he was, I'm not saying that sentence is a pure, illustration or manifestation of Tolkien's thoughts about Overmod and the Battle of Malden. But there is no doubt in my mind that stuff was passing through his mind when he wrote that sentence. Overbold is almost exactly the translation of it, right? Isn't that the translation Tolkien uses when he translates that in the Battle of Malden? Yeah, overbold is his translation of overmode, right? Yeah, that's what I thought. Anyway, well, Eric, see that's a fascinating point. Eric says it's odd that he hyphenated it here. It was unhyphenated in Middle English. Yes, just one word, overbold, which supports the Sparrow-Alden theory that hyphenated words are designed to suggest words that were one concept in another language. The word overbold as a single word, be not overbold, without the hyphen, as indeed it would have been done in Middle English. That's not a normal word in modern English anymore. So instead of just doing a straight throwback, he hyphenated. He's not going to put it as two separate words because it's not a two-word thing. This is a one-word concept, but he hyphenates it. And yes, by the way, I've moved on from the politics discussion, but those of you who are talking about elections and things, you are certainly correct. I don't think Tolkien's anti-democracy per se, but I agree with the several of you who are saying that the reason there's such a strong correlation with bad elected officials is that the people who want to be leaders and get themselves elected democratically tend to be the bad people for the job. That Tolkien very much believed that the only people who could be trusted with power were the people who didn't want it. Just like I always say, I have a hard time supporting anybody for president because they're running. It's a bad look. Like the optics are bad on that. So I've never yet been able to elect a president who wasn't attempting to get him or herself elected. And therefore, because I kind of agree with Tolkien on this particular political point. But anyway, okay, let's keep going. But to creep into the, this is, after Tal-Elmar he's getting close to the Numenorean camp, and we learn, by the way, that his people never go outside in the dark because they're all afraid of the dark. But he's been out in the dark, and he was once sent by the master in an early attempt by the master to get Tal-Elmar killed. He was sent out to spy on the people of Udul. But to creep into the unfriendly fields of Udul by night was another and far worse thing than just being out by night on a long walk. Yet he had dared to do it, and he had come so close to one of the huts of the watchmen that he could hear the men inside speaking in vain. He could not understand the purport of their speech. The tones seemed mournful and full of fear, as men's voices were at night in the world as he knew it. And a few words he seemed to recognize, but not enough for understanding. I love it when Tolkien talks about language like this. Very few other people talk about language like this, right? Most authors would just be like, they were speaking a different language that he didn't understand. Whereas Tolkien is all like, he seemed to recognize a few words, but he couldn't quite piece it together. And yet the Udul folk were their near neighbors. Let's talk about their linguistic relationships, shall we? And a few words he seemed to recognize. Right, sorry. And yet the Udul folk were their near neighbors. Indeed, though Tal-Elmar and his people had forgotten it, as they had forgotten so much, their near kin. part of the same people and passed in better years. What hope then? So notice what he's pointing back to language diversion. The people of Udul and the people of, what's it called? Adar? Or something like that. Where they're living. What's the... Agar. That's it. Yeah. Agar. Not Adar. Nah. No connection, I'm sure. Peoples of Middle-earth. Am I right? Anyway, never mind. So Udul and Agar. And they were kin. They spoke the same language before, by implication, but their languages have diverged. And Tal-Elmar is instinctively a good enough linguist to know. It's probably because he's so tough. Like, you can tell that he is, like, in his heart of hearts, a philologist, a born philologist, because of how tough and great a fighter he is. Because everybody knows, philologists, don't mess with them. But anyway, so he has this instinctive idea that if the people of Udul are their near neighbors, but their language is so different that he can't understand it, then these people, their language must be like, there's no way he's going to be able to understand it at all. What hope then was there that he would recognize any single word or even interpret rightly the tones of the tongue of men alien from his own since the beginning of the world? Alien from his own? My own? But they are not my people. That is the people of Agar, only my father. And again, he had that strange feeling coming from where he knew not, to this young lad, born and bred in a decaying, half-savage people, the feeling that he was not going to meet aliens, but kinsmen from afar and friends. Somehow he knows that these people, the Numenoreans, who are not his grandmother's people, by the way, these are the men of Westernesse, she was from Easternesse, but somehow he's not going to meet aliens from afar, but friends, kinsmen from afar. Again, what kind of connection is this? It's not genetic. Is it even blood? Maybe. Kinsman? Maybe. From Ryui far afar. Never go in against a philologist when Overmod is on the line, says Erocheb. Yeah, something like that. Okay. So much happening here. By the way, if you remember the footnotes, Christopher tells us that Tolkien jotted down in the margins here what the men of Udul that Tal-Elmar had been hearing were saying. The reason the people of Udul were invading them and the people of Agar had to beat off the people of Udul and, thwart their wicked attempt to come and usurp their lands and drive them out. What was actually happening is that the people of Udul were experiencing a pestilence and were in desperate, desperate need and were just coming to steal food because they had nothing to eat and were dying. Notice how once again we're getting the both sides, even when Tolkien has to scrawl the both sides in a marginal note, Jackie, he's still doing it here, right? There is something here of Tal-Elmar's blood sort of resonating, calling out to these other people. But I'm not, again, I brought this up again here in my subtitle, talking about Tal-Elmar's blood, because again, this is another one of those moments where, if you wanted to make the argument that Tolkien is, that this is by Tolkien another sort of fictional application of late 19th and early 20th century race theory. You could do it. Like you could use this as support for that argument. It would work that way. But I'm not convinced that that's the story. Certainly not the whole story of what's going on here. Because it's no longer even as simple as it's no longer even as simple as his grandmother's kindred. If he were meeting them, maybe. But he's not. The connection is from much further afar, I think, than that. And I'm not sure. When I ask myself, as far as we can tell, because we're getting towards the end of the story, so we don't know for sure, what's going to be revealed necessarily. I'm not sure that the thing that he's feeling, the thing that makes them kinsmen from afar and friends, is not blood connection, but rather elf friendship, perhaps. Somebody earlier on, and I forget who it was, when we were talking about this before, was thinking about like as if elf friendship could be inherited. I think it was David Michael talking about that. So yeah, Fencing Frog, it does sort of sound like a spiritual connection. No, he does not. Tal-Elmar does not have any elf friends that he knows of. But again, that's why it seems to be like it is kind of connected to his blood. Like he has elf friend, but he has some kind of spiritual inheritance of elf friendship. He doesn't personally have any elf friends. But it's as if the elf friendship of his ancestors has been inherited by him. Maybe he's a half elf friend. JJ, is that what you get when you're hanging out with Elrond? You become a half elf friend. Yeah, exactly. The whole business about his Eric, as you say, elevated worldview, the kindness with which he treats his elders and stuff like that. It does sound elvish. It does sound like the kind of thing that elves might teach to, people like this. Anyway, let's keep going. This is near the very, very end. We're already now in the place where it's just manuscript, right? And so Christopher can't read it all. Because by the time he gets here, Tolkien's writing really, really fast. And he just walks out to meet the Numenoreans on the beach. That is Tal-Elmar, not Tolkien. He had seen the sun sink into the sea before. Yet never before had he seen it so. He knew in a flash, as if it came from that fire itself, that he had seen it so. He was called, maybe? That it meant something more than the approach of the king's time? The dark? So the dark they call the king's time. His people do. They call the king's time the dark. That's why they don't go out at dark. Because Sauron is the king in question, Tolkien tells us in the margins. And Christopher tells us in the notes. When is a sunset more than just a sunset? When is a sunset more than just the end of the light and the beginning of the hopefully brief dominion of darkness? Today, it's something more. The sun setting in the west over the sea means more to him. He rose as if led or driven, and as if led or driven, walked openly down the hill and across the long sward to the shingles and the tents. Could he have seen himself, he would have been struck with wonder, no less than those who saw him now from the shore. His naked skin, for he wore only a loincloth and little cloak of something fur cast back and caught by a thong to his shoulder, glowed in the, probably, sunset light. His fair hair, too, was kindled, and his step was light and free. "Look," cried one of the watchmen to his companion. "Do you see what I see? Is it not one of the Eldar of the woods that comes to speak with us? So they think he's, what, a green elf, maybe? Like a sylvan elf? The Eldar of the woods? So the Numenoreans don't take him for a Numenorean. They take him for an elf. This is another reason why I think at the end of the day, it's something elvish that's being passed down. And it's not seeming, it doesn't seem to be being passed down through his blood any more than his genes. He doesn't have elvish blood, I don't think. I bet he does smell like an elf right now, Fencing Frog. Totally. They seized him, but not with harsh handling, when they found he was weaponless and submissive, and led him to a tent where sat one in authority. This is after he speaks in like the human language, and they're like, dude, not an elf. Tal-Elmar feels the language to be known and only veiled from him. So notice, Tolkien has been writing so rapidly, he's now shifting to plot outline mode. He shifts out of the direct narrative. He's going in and out of the direct narrative, and sometimes just making notes about what is happening. Tal-Elmar feels the language to be known and only veiled from him. So it was not like overhearing the people of, what was it? Udul. That was it. Udul. It's not like the people of Udul, where he could recognize some words, but he couldn't quite put it together. Here, he feels like he knows their language, but it's veiled from him. What language is it? What are they speaking? Possibly they're speaking Adunaic, but I think it's more likely that they're speaking Sindarin, because they're the faithful. Anyway, okay. The captain says Tal-Elmar must be of Numenorean race, or of the people akin to them. Oh wait, is that who the people of Easternesse are? He must be kindly treated. He guesses that he had been made captive as a babe, or born of captives. Maybe he washed up in a boat, as a baby. That kind of thing happens all the time. People are real careless with Numenorean babies, apparently. He is trying to escape to us, he says. A pity he remembers nothing of the language. He will learn. Maybe, but after a long time. If he spoke it now, he could tell us much that would speed our errand and lessen our peril. They make Tal-Elmar at last understand their desire to know how many men dwell near. Are they friendly? Are they like he is? The object of the Numenoreans is to occupy this land, and in alliance with the cruels of the north, to drive out the dark people and make a settlement to threaten the king. Or is this while Sauron is absent in Numenor? The object of the Numenoreans is to occupy this land, and in alliance with the cruels of the north, meaning the king's men, black Numenoreans, to drive out the dark people, that is, Agar, Udul, men in the caves, the whole lot. So that they can make a settlement from which to threaten the king. Probably Pelargir, I'm guessing. Which is the closest Numenorean settlement to Mordor, after all, right? Again, notice how once again, Tolkien isn't telling the other side. Well, no, he is telling the other side. He's telling the other side of the colonial question again. Oh, so yeah. So on the one hand, okay, Tal-Elmar, what's he going to say if he comes back home to his dad? So, Dad, good news and bad news. Good news is that these guys are good guys, they're not slavers, so they're not going to fill their ship with a whole bunch of us and bring us back and eat us and or sacrifice us on their altars. That's the good news. Bad news is that they're going to take our lands and drive all of us out. But you can reassure yourself that you're being displaced from your lands by the good guys. It's really, really interesting. Really complicated. Oh, the bad guys, these are good guys. Though they are in an alliance with the bad guys. Because they share the aim of driving all of us out. Okay. And yeah, Sauron seems to still be in Mordor in that last sentence. But then in the parenthetical, we're not quite sure about that, right? The whole filling the ships with black sails with people to bring back and sacrifice sounded very Sauron is absent in Numenor to me. Yeah. So complex. Like, how are we supposed to respond to this? Where is Tolkien envisioning, like, the sympathies of his readers? This is a story in which Tolkien is in no way shying away from the displaced people question, the colonial issues. Even in the case, like, we think about, like, Pelargir, right? The faithful, the settlements of the faithful. We've got the Black Numenoreans, and they were very bad. So they probably did very bad things to the natives. You know, they were allied with Sauron the whole time and everything. And it's really, they were very bad people, the King's men. But fortunately, the faithful were the good guys. So we don't even question when they made their landing, you know, their harbors at Pelargir. I'm sure they didn't displace anybody because they're the good guys. Except remember, it's already there in the Lord of the Rings. Remember? Remember the people? Remember the king of the mountain whom Isildur has an alliance with that live right there in the middle of Gondor? But then they break the oath and are cursed by Isildur, right? The oath breakers, the ghosts in the mountain, paths of the dead. It's already there. There were natives. There were peoples who were being displaced by the Numenoreans. But like, does that mean that the faithful and Isildur and Elendil are bad guys then? Well, no. No, it's not simple in either way. Tolkien is really in this story inviting us to look into, I mean, when Tolkien does dig into the point of view of displaced people, it's complicated. He's inviting us into a complicated story. And as I say, I am fascinated to imagine, all we can do is imagine where he would have gone. Like where our sympathies as readers would have been directed. We're almost done. Or does he understand Numenorean? This is Tolkien talking to himself now, completely. Right, speculating about where to take the story. Wait a second. Maybe instead of it, like him kind of thinking he can understand it, but there's a veil between him and the language or whatever. No, maybe he just understands it. Maybe he just speaks Numenorean. Added subsequently, Eldarin. These were elf friends. Okay, so no, maybe it's not Numenorean that he speaks. So it's not, I almost said Azanul Bizarre. It's not Adunaic that he understands. It's Eldarin. Okay. Cinder, whatever. He said when he heard the men speak to one another, "This is strange for you to speak the language of my long dreams. Yet surely now I stand in my own land and do not sleep." They were astonished and said, "Why did you not speak so to us before? You spoke like the people of the dark." So when he said, Tal-Elmar, when he says this is strange for you to speak the language of my long dreams, he says that in Sindarin. They were astonished and said, "Why did you not speak to us so before? You spoke like the people of the dark, who are our enemies, being servants of our enemy." Like you sounded like a servant of Sauron. And Tal-Elmar answered, "Because this tongue has only returned to my mind hearing you speak it. And because how should I have known that you would understand the language of my dreams? You are not like those who spoke in my dreams. Nay, a little like, but they were brighter and more beautiful." No offense. Then the men were still more astonished and said, "It seems that you have spoken with the Eldar, whether awake or in vision." "Who are the Eldar?" said Tal-Elmar. "That name I did not hear in my dream." Yeah, Jackie, I agree. He's talking to himself, making notes, and then he just flips the dialogue switch again. Yeah. Notice again, it's not about genes. It's not about blood. It's about contact with the elves. They're like, "Oh yeah, you should have told us you were an elf friend and have been taught the languages of the elves." And he's like, "I haven't been. I just heard it in my dream. Why didn't you speak it before?" "Because I didn't know it before. I had learned that language in my dreams and I only remembered it when I heard you speak it. And even if I had known it, like, how would I know you'd know my dream language?" The idea that Tal-Elmar has a dream language, come on, that's like the most Tolkien thing ever. It's almost like wish fulfillment. Tolkien had a recurring dream of a green wave engulfing the land. But he really wishes he'd had a recurring dream in which he was taught a language, right? Like that he had a language that was given to him in a dream. Yeah. But he's never heard of the Eldar. Amazing. Amazing stuff. Then suddenly fear and the memory of old tales came upon Tal-Elmar again, and he quailed. "What would you do to me?" he cried. "Would you lure me to the black-winged boat and give me to the dark?" "You or your kin, at least, belong already to the dark," they answered. "We are the deliverers." "But why do you speak so of the black sails? The black sails are to us a sign of honor, for they are the fair night before the coming of the enemy, and upon the black are set the silver stars of Elbereth. The black sails of our captain have passed further up the water." Still Tal-Elmar was afraid, because he was not yet able to imagine black as anything but the symbol of the night of fear. But he looked as boldly as he could and answered, "Not all my kind. We fear the dark, but we do not love it nor serve it. At least so do some of us. So does my father. And him I love. I would not be torn from him, not even to see the Eldar." "Alas," they said, "your time of dwelling in these hills is come to an end. Here the men of the West have resolved to make their homes, and the folk of the dark must depart, or be slain." "Sorry. Displacement forthcoming." "What? Not servants of the enemy?" "Well, but you're very like servants of the enemy." I mean, again, it's amazing. These are the faithful. These are the faithful. So interesting. And here's Tal-Elmar being presented with something like the reality behind this both physical and spiritual inheritance that he has, blessing that he has. which I think is some kind of elf thing, not blood, because it's not about his blood. Well, indirectly about his blood, but it's not because he has elf blood. There's no hint he has elf blood. And yet here is him choosing his people, or at least his dad. Not so worried about Mulgrew, but I love my father. As I say, I have a hard time imagining where he was going to go. Where he was going to take us in this story. It's a really remarkable story. And the one thing I will say, again, it's really complicated. But the next time you hear somebody talking about imperialism or indigenous peoples or displaced peoples in Tolkien's writings, send them here. Right? Hold up your hand and say, I'm sorry. Have you read Tal-Elmar? If you haven't read Tal-Elmar, we can't have this discussion. Go read Tal-Elmar, then we can have this discussion. Because seriously, there's more here than in anywhere else in Tolkien's writings about this. So fascinating. Yeah, what would have happened? I have to say, of all of the fragments of stories that we have from Tolkien, this might be the one that I have the hardest time guessing where on earth we're going with this story. Like, where does this story end? Where are we going to get? Are we going to get to, like, Elendu? Are we going to get to is Tal-Elmar going to join the Numenoreans and be like, well, as long as you don't kill my dad, I don't care if you displace the rest of my people because they're kind of jerks anyway. And become a good little faithful Numenorean, and it's going to become a story about Numenor and about the faithful and the Kingsmen? Is it going to be? Is the resistance to the Numenoreans that we are being prompted to, even through their own words? You must depart or be slain. Sorry, it's the way it is. We're here. We're taking this land. It's ours now. Because we've resolved to make our homes here. So, and we're stronger than you. So, yeah. Is he going to continue in that line? Again, this muddying of the good guys and bad guys as far as the Numenoreans are concerned? Which could be really interesting. Showing the faithful as not untainted by Numenorean culture, late Numenorean culture. What's going to happen to the guy, Tal-Elmar? Is he going to become a Numenorean hero? Is he going to become a hero among his own people? Is he going to not become a hero at all? I don't even know. I don't even know. As I say, I'm trying to think of another story that I have a harder time imagining where it's headed than this one. He becomes a Nazgul. Maybe. Just like Aarion in the Rings of Power. Anyway, okay. Yeah, amazing stuff. There is no more, Christopher tells us. At the foot of the page, my father wrote Tal-Elmar twice, and his own name twice. And also, maybe it was just me. Was anybody else reminded of the old Monty Python sketch, The Wide World of Novel Writing? When it's like a play-by-play commentary of Thomas Hardy sitting down to write The Return of the Native. And it's specifically the moment where I think it's Michael Palin says, oh, and he signed his name again. And then, the color commentator comes on and says, oh, it looks like Tess of the D'Urbervilles all over again. It's so good. It's so good. It's just, yeah. Thomas Hardy sitting down to write a novel, and it's being commentated by a football play-by-play and color commentator. Hilarious. If you've never heard this, I'm sure you can find it on YouTube. Really, really good one. That was the sketch that introduced me to the collective plural of nouns. Michael Palin, the play-by-play announcer, says, and here comes the first verb of the novel, and it's was, and the crowd are going wild. As an American, I'd never heard that before. Anyway, okay. All right. Sorry. Okay, so he signs his name again. And also, Tal-Elmar in Rovanian, Wilderland, Anduin the Great River, Sea of Rune, and Etten-Moors. Well, that clears it up. Okay. Why he wrote Tal-Elmar twice at the end is not all that weird. Because that could easily have been written... it could be part of him trying to think of more things to write. It could be him coming later across this piece of paper and being like, this is the end of Tal-Elmar. Fencing Frog says that there will be a geography quiz, it seems. Yes. It sounds like a multiple choice question. Tal-Elmar in A, Rovanian, B, Wilderland, C, Anduin the Great River, D, Sea of Rune, or E, Etten-Moors. My answer is C, Anduin the Great River. Even though no river is alluded to in the story, but Pelargir-ish, maybe. Right. Fencing Frog says all of them at once, I suppose. Yeah, something like that. JJ says, why do I get the feeling we're going to need to remember some of this for Mythmoot quiz night? There are sometimes some pretty deep cut Mythgard Academy related questions at Mythmoot trivia. Laurel doesn't pull punches. Oh man. Anyway, certainly these jotted notes at the end would seem to imply that Tolkien does not know for sure where we are. I cannot imagine that Etten-Moors has anything to do with the geography of the story so far, as the Etten-Moors very distinctly has no western shore is not on the coast, right? Wilderland is a little vague. Could be in the Sea of Rune. That could be the sea in question that the sun is setting behind, I suppose. Any of those places, the Sea of Rune, Etten-Moors, both of those places would be strange places for Numenoreans to land their ships. But 80 Pearl points out that everything's on the coast if you walk far enough. Yeah, and you can get there dry shot if you don't mind. If you can find a boat with which to cross the Anduin, I suppose. Okay. Well, that is the mysterious end. That is the mysterious end of Tal-Elmar. Maureen, that should be the next what if. What if Tal-Elmar was finished? What's the ending? Yeah, something like that. What a fascinatingly tantalizing, unusual, and interesting story Tal-Elmar is. And with that, we have come to the last slide in the last session of the last book of the history of Middle-earth. What a fun moment. And I am delighted to have come through this with you guys. I look forward to beginning a new book. I can keep focusing on the end. Like, it's not like the end of the series. We're going to go off and do Fantasties next, starting on June 3rd. So join me in a few weeks so it'll be Wednesday, June 3rd, for the first evening of Fantasties. And then we'll see. We will be, while we're discussing Fantasties, we will arrange an election and see what we can decide to do next after that. But thanks very much, everybody, for joining me. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, which I would never have had without you, of going through the history of Middle-earth like I have. As I said at the beginning, it has been, I don't know that I can think back of any single project that I have ever done in my entire academic career that has been more rewarding, more transformative than this study of the history of Middle-earth. I have learned so much, and I am very grateful to all of you for your patience and enthusiasm, without which this series wouldn't have happened, and I certainly would not have. It is only because of your enthusiasm that I am able to shoehorn a few hours every week to read and think carefully about the history of Middle-earth. And my life has been greatly enriched by those hours. So I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you. Thanks, everybody. And I look forward to Fantasties in a few weeks. All right. Thanks, everybody. Good night now. Bye.